This morning we woke up to the news that his administration has launched a 30-day review into AUKUS, the agreement under which Australia will acquire between 3 and 5 Virginia-class subs from the United States in the early 2030s, and then build 5 SSN AUKUS-class submarines, which are due to come into service in the early 2040s. So let me ask you, first, John, you've spent a lot of time in the Pentagon in your career. What do you make of this review? What is its purpose? What's the likely outcome?
First, every administration questions the decisions of their predecessor. I mean, and it's become a common problem now in America where, you know, every administration thinks the predecessor was a dope and they've got to change what they inherited. And so partly it's that. There has been an undertow of concern coming from the Navy, honestly, that AUKUS is going to make it hard for the Navy to get its own ships. So that's the second thing. Normally, administrations, when they come into office, you know, every succeeding month they get deeper and stronger. This administration is getting shallower with every succeeding month. I mean, they got rid of the National Security Council staff. They're cutting the State Department in half. They're making their base shallower. Honestly, I'm not terribly worried about this review. I mean, Australia has very high standing, in the U.S. political and security establishment. A review will be constructive.
Do you think that this review is a way of creating leverage to get greater contributions from Australia?
I think there is a general perception, forgive me for saying it this way, that the Albanese government has been supportive of AUKUS, but not really leaning in on AUKUS. I think that's felt, more widely here, than people realize.
In light of what you've just said to us, which is very interesting, which is you've said that there's a perception in Washington that may not be fully understood in Australia, that the Albanese government has supported AUKUS but hasn't really leaned into AUKUS. In light of that, what would be your advice to Mr. Albanese if and when he meets with Mr. Trump?
President Trump brings to his presidency his life experiences as a developer of physical property, real property. So I think he looks at Russia and China as the zoning commission of Atlantic City, and he wants a bigger hotel, and he's going to do what it takes to get a bigger hotel. He's going to charm them, threaten them, wine them, dine them, that sort of thing. I think he views allies as subcontractors, and he's needed subcontractors. No developer can build anything without subcontractors, but he's always cheated them and abused them. So, and I think he views allies as subcontractors. When I talk with dear friends in allied countries, I always tell them, don't try to make the great emperor happy by offering trophies. Become the best, strongest subcontractor you can be. Just be strong. And that means, invest in your own security, invest in your own diplomacy, bring to the table things that they don't have, but don't make it a peace offering. Just be a strong ally. And, when you're a strong subcontractor, he's going to keep coming back to you.
The poll that will come out on Monday shows that 67% of Australians, that's 2/3 of Australians, continue to favour acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. And that number has held firm over the 4 years since the deal was announced. I think it was 70% when it was announced 4 years ago, 67% now, so very close. 2/3 support nuclear-powered subs. That's a very high number when you're asking about especially such an expensive capability. So, John, my question to you is, you've said you feel pretty confident that they won't kill AUKUS, that they'll review it, that this is a good thing to do. But let's jump to the worst case scenario. If Donald Trump were to decide that this was a bad deal, this was a stupid deal that his predecessor launched into, if he were to kill it or to drive up the price in such a way that it fell away, what do you think would be the impact on the alliance with Australia, but also more broadly, allied perceptions of US reliability if the US were to step away from such a big, considered, important arrangement?
I do think the Albanese government has been supportive of AUKUS, but they need to lean more into AUKUS. And I think that that's the one thing I would recommend, that you want to come to Washington in a way where you are a stronger ally, not somebody who is seen as a weak partner who's a supplicant and riding on American security. I personally, I reject that argument about Australia, about most of our allies, frankly. But we've got politicians that look at this rather superficially, and frankly, defense spending per GDP is part of that. So, but you should address it on your own. You live in a more complicated world. You had Chinese, combatants circumnavigating Australia. Okay, that was a signal. Okay, that was a signal. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're not intimidated by that. And I think AUKUS is one of the best ways to show that.
It feels like both China and Russia have a reasonably good handle on President Trump. What do you think Mr. Trump thinks about the West? President Biden would often say that foreign policy was about a contest between democracy and autocracy. Does Mr. Trump believe that? Does he see himself as the leader of the free world?
It's going to become a less structured, less predictable American government. It's going to be a bit more spontaneous and uncertain. And the question is, there are a number of external constraints that ultimately will come around him, but they aren't there now. And, allies just have to think about how they deal with that. He's not a student of international structural theory. He's not a student of Hans Morgenthau. He's not a student of Ramon. He's his own person and very confident in his own judgment, but his life experiences have been very transactional, and unfortunately he's making the structure around him more shallow. So I think allies have to understand it's going to be kind of a choppy 3 years. It may, things may change a bit next year if they lose control of the House, but it's going to become more choppy. And so this is why I come back again to my central recommendation. Don't go to an international venue to try to offer beautiful trophies for the emperor. Become the strongest ally that we have. Do things that are important for yourself. Strengthen your diplomacy, strengthen your defense.
Does democracy versus autocracy mean much to President Trump? Would he recognize himself as the leader of the free world, or would he recognize himself as a big beast in Atlantic City trying to maximize his profit, for example?
I don't think he has a structural understanding of international relations or of alliances. I think he has a transactional perspective on how he has to work with people that matter to him. And it's very clear China matters to him. It's also very clear that he went into this tariff war without having a strategy. And so he's now wrestling with all of that.
When you squint your eyes on President Trump and the Russia-Ukraine war, What's his settling point, do you think? Because a while ago, it seemed like he was becoming much more critical of Russia. You know, he said, I'm not happy. He said in April, I'm not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Vladimir, stop, he said on Truth Social. But then again, I noticed after Operation Spiderweb, the amazing Ukrainian operation where they sent drones to attack Russian air bases by loading them onto prefabricated homes and then popping the lids off. After that incident, President Trump spoke to President Putin, and I noticed that President Trump said, you know, Vladimir Putin told me he would have to respond very strongly to this Ukrainian operation. But President Trump didn't say whether he'd urged him not to, or whether he'd urged him to moderate or not to attack civilians, for example. So what is Trump's settling point on Russia, Ukraine?
I don't think there is one. I think that his starting point was about where everybody else is, and that is, Russia can't win, but Ukraine isn't strong enough to push Russia out of Ukraine. I mean, I think that's fundamentally his starting point, and frankly, that's where most analysts are. And so the question is how do we bring this to some kind of a conclusion? And it, I think he felt, for whatever reason, I don't know all the details. I don't know. I think he felt that he could bring, a more subservient Ukraine to the table, and Russia would take that as a peace offering. That's not where Putin is. I mean, Putin is too invested in a narrative of his own making that isn't viable. And so this war was not going to end that way. This war will only end when, frankly, when Europe, NATO, creates a deterrent structure and brings it to cover Ukraine. And, Ukraine on its own cannot create a deterrent structure. Only NATO can do that. The Biden administration was too afraid of trying to do that. They didn't have that vision. They didn't have that courage. Trump doesn't understand that. It means that we would have to bring Ukraine into NATO quickly, but we'd also have to say to Ukraine, we're not going to help you recover the territories you lost. We're going to protect what you are now, but we're not going to help recover the territories you lost. And that would have been a gigantic sacrifice, for the Ukrainians too. And I don't know that they were prepared to make that. So unfortunately, we're drifting into a prolonged conflict.
You've mentioned China a couple of times. I have a question from the Institute's Senior Fellow for East Asia, Richard McGregor. It's a simple question. Has the Trump administration settled on a clear China policy, and does it have a plan to execute it?
No, they don't. President Trump, I don't think has a strategic view of China. I think he has a sense of tactics he wants to use for some purpose. Now, Bridge Colby and some of the people in the administration do have a very focused view, and that is they have to defeat China when China tries to invade Taiwan. And I think there are so many different problems associated with formulating it that way. So there are a few people in the administration that have that, but I wouldn't say that that's Trump's view. I don't think that is Trump's view.
One name you haven't mentioned is the Vice President, J.D. Vance. What's your assessment of his vice presidency so far?
J.D. Vance is trying to find a way, like every vice president does, to be helpful to the president, not get in the way, and not make him mad at you, And so I think J.D. Vance is calibrating himself. He certainly wants to succeed Donald Trump. He can't do that if the Trump base voters think he's disloyal. So he has to be consistent and supportive of the base. And he has to try to find a way where he can make a contribution. Um, so far, he's done that through being kind of the pit bull that's beside the owner that attacks whoever comes in the door. And but ultimately, that isn't what gets you elected, and it's hard. It's hard to just develop an authentic, independent reputation when you're vice president, because you don't control what your president does, but you inherit everything that happens. So I think he's being careful. He's trying to do what most vice presidents do, which is find some Lebensraum. I mean, how do I survive inside this posture? How do I be seen as supportive of the president, and how do I not damage my prospects when I run against, I run to try to succeed him. And that's a complicated landscape, for anybody. That was Joe Biden's problem. That was Kamala Harris's problem. That's every vice president's problem. It's a really tough position to be in.
All right, final question. I want to ask you about an issue of domestic policy that is getting an enormous amount of play, and that is the anti-deportation protests in Los Angeles, other parts of California, other parts of the United States. We saw these protests initially peaceful, then some violence. It seems like the Californian authorities were slow off the mark. Donald Trump, I guess, has certainly leaned into it, deploying National Guard and some other forces. How do you feel? How do you feel about how that issue is playing out at the moment, in particular the deployment of the Guard? And do you think in the end this will play in President Trump's favor or against him?
Donald Trump will be the winner on this, because when people see rioting in the streets, they personally feel insecure. They think about vulnerabilities in their own community, and they want security. And they think that Donald Trump stood up and brought that, and they thought Gavin Newsom waffled and failed. So this was a very large gift to Donald Trump. This was one of those silver platter things. Put it right in front of him and let him decide how to enjoy it. It was a big mistake. Democrats have to understand that average citizens, they feel, when something like this happens, they feel great insecurity. And when we had the hurricane that went into New Orleans, and we had all these people stranded, Democrats saw them as victims. Republicans saw them as lawless. Okay. And that divide is there. And when Democrats don't realize when something like this happens in the street, Americans are going to side with a strong man that brings safety. So Donald Trump won on this.
John, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for giving us some straight talk from Washington. Often the analysis we get of President Trump is on the extreme side, but your analysis is like a cool glass of water. So thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with John Hamre as much as I have, and please join me in thanking John.